Welcome to the Leadership with Biana Kovic Show, and thank you for being with us. Our topic, leadership, focuses on leaders such as yourselves. We believe that leadership is a skill that can be learned through practice and awareness. It is our hope that our conversation will help you become more reflective when it comes to your own leadership practices and enable you to leave a positive legacy. Our very special guest is Rabbi Elchanan Poupko. Rabbi Poupko is a writer, teacher, speaker, and an 11th generation rabbi. Rabbi Poupko is the founding editor of the rabbinical journal The Lamdan and has written for more than a dozen publications on topics varying from medical ethics to politics. Rabbi Poupko is also the president of the Israeli American Jewish Network and a member of the Rabbinical Council of America. Rabbi Poupko, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Biana. Thanks for having me.
Rabbi Poupko, I am very excited to have you on my show. You are the writer. You're also a rabbi and a teacher who is particularly focused on youth development. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your work.
Thank you. What I do is, like you said, I'm a rabbi and I'm also a writer. And on my day-to-day job, what I do is I'm a teacher. And so a lot of my focus is on what it is that we can be doing to empower young people, to give them confidence and to show them what kind of world it is that they should aspire to be living in. It's fascinating because one of the most incredible changes in fact, human history is that teachers today are preparing children for a world the teachers don't know. So even if you look around today, at least a third of the people in the workforce today are working in jobs that didn't exist when they were in school. And so it's an incredible challenge for teachers to make sure that they are preparing children for this kind of world and to sort of think big about what is it that would do best for these young people, what is best for them, what would prepare them most for the world that they are going to live in.
So what are the effective ways that teachers, parents can prepare kids for the rapid change that is happening today?
I think that one of the greatest challenges is to educate children for innovation and creativity, because even though we don't know what kind of world kids are going to be living in 5-10 years from now, we do know that creativity is going to be the commodity of the 21st century.
You know, some folks believe that creativity is something that you're born with. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. A friend of mine is a professor at Columbia University, and he focuses specifically on the topic of innovation and how to teach innovation. His name is Professor Yaakov Goldenberg, and he wrote a book called Inside the Box, where we usually tend to think that creativity is the ability to think outside of the box. But in fact, there are methods that can be used to develop creativity. And really, there are ways to be teaching kids about how to be creative, how to be innovative without having them to be the stigma of a crazy genius or someone who has a mind that's all over the place. It's in fact something that is predictable and teachable.
And a lot of us that do want to try to do things outside the box, we're afraid of failing. What are your advice for adults who wants to try to do things outside the box?
That's a great question. I think that we often tend to associate failure with sort of the end of ways, the end of possibilities, when in fact it's just the beginning. Someone asked me not long ago what the definition of success is, and I said the definition of success is failing many times. Because if you are not failing, that means you're not trying. And so, as Wayne Gretzky, the famous hockey player, said famously, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So if you take a shot, then, you may get it, you may not. If you don't take it, you're for sure not going to get it. If you look at a kid and they're learning how to walk, how many times is it that they fall and tumble and cry? And if it were adults doing it, after 5-6 times, we'd be like, oh, walking isn't my thing. But obviously, right, that's not what we should be doing. So I think no matter what it is that you're pursuing, you got to try. And if you're not failing enough times, that means you're not trying.
And for the managers, in in workforce, it's all about production. And sometimes production does not allow space for creativity. What are your advice for the managers, especially junior managers that might feel like, okay, I need to push this person to perform and cannot allow space for too much creativity or failure?
So I think a great example for that is if you look at the most successful companies of this day and age, the most successful companies are not necessarily the ones that are restrictive or very fixed. It's things like Google, Twitter, people who really just thought completely out of the box. And creativity is the greatest commodity of today's day and age. You look at Google, they weren't making money for their first, I don't know how many years. I remember those days where you went to a page and there was just a search bar. So Yahoo and all the other search engines had ads on this side and they were trying to give you this product, that product, and you had Google there with just a search bar. And it's really the creativity that took time that was the one that was the most profitable. And look at other companies, Uber, Airbnb, it's all companies that there's no way you could have come to someone and say, okay, I need money now, do something. It took the time and thinking to create those.
So the key is allowing yourself enough time to explore.
Absolutely. If you look at the race that took place in the second part of the 20th century between Soviet Russia and the United States, Soviet Russia was much more disciplined, much more focused, and sort of in the classical way, the way you would imagine a manager. And the United States was really taking the more creative, big picture type of look at things. And I think that's what drives innovation and the greatest companies today.
I'd like to segue and talk a little bit about preventing suicide in youth, because it's a big subject nowadays. And I know that you're an expert at it. You're very familiar with that. Can you talk to us a little bit about it and how can one effectively go preventing the suicide rate in youth?
So in general, suicide is an epidemic today in modern society. It's one of the 10 leading causes of death in America. And it's something that should concern everyone. If you are a parent of a teenager, that should be your number one concern. And I think a lot of people are starting to take it seriously. There's some legislation being passed. I think that most important is that kids know that they have someone to reach out to in times of despair. So they're never alone. And there's nothing that they can do that they can't come to a trusting and trustworthy adult and say, listen, I messed up. I made a mistake. And it sort of has to do with that idea that I mentioned before about failure. It's okay to fail. You see in Japan sometimes it's accepted in some situations for a teen to say, oh, I failed my grades. I can't come back to my family. That should not be something that happens. I think people knowing that it's okay to make a mistake, that's one thing that's important. The other is creating real connections. Young people today have hundreds of social media friends, but some of them don't even have 5 real friends. And so creating that human-to-human connection, there's a incredible study that shows, with regard to substance abuse, a linear correlation between the number of family dinners and substance abuse. So if the family has dinner no times a week, the likelihood is very high. If it's once a week, a bit lower, twice a week, a bit lower. And finally, family dinner 7 times a week, it's incredibly low. So making sure that kids have those human connections is very important. The New York Times had a piece not long ago about the connection between teen depression and social media. I think kids need to know there's life beyond social media. They need to know that that's not their life. And if someone shames them or someone bullies them, you need to address it. But they also need to know that they have friends and family and people who care for them, not just on that platform, and that it's okay. And, if they deleted their profile, nothing would happen. They would still have a life and a community.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting at that age, and sometimes at any age, the bad things happen, they seem to be very final. People take them very personal. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. We can sometimes, even adults can go down the rabbit hole where we sort of think, oh my gosh, I got into this social media disagreement with someone. This is like everything. But then if you just disconnect, if you just turn off your computer, it's like, wow, look, the birds are still chirping, the trees are still beautiful. So we do need to emphasize a tech diet. We just need that time where we disconnect, where we focus on the real world and recognize that there's more to life than that.
So bringing in more balance.
Absolutely. Knowing that there's a world beyond. and really having those loving and caring relationships, because there are no real life relationships except in extreme cases where something is the end. You can have hundreds of situations online where you just delete the person, you block them, and that happens all the time. But it's rare to have a situation in real life where someone who you know and see daily, you just block them. Usually the foundation of that relationship is stronger, and so you learn to see that things are not fatalistic. Like you said, if it's not the end of the world, then you just move on. There was just 2-3 weeks ago a big story with New York Times columnist Bret Stephens, who got a lot of hate on Twitter because of his sort of bipartisan nature, where he sometimes will take this position, sometimes the other. And at some point he said, you know what, I'm just deleting my Twitter account, and that's fine. And, you know, he can focus on his wife and kids and colleagues in his room, and that's fine. So I think teens, because they are so born into this tech generation, sometimes tend to see the whole world that way. And it's the job of responsible adults to say, look, there's more. You know, you can join this soccer team or join this community group, volunteer here, or hang out with your cousins if anyone does that today still. That's something that can give you an anchor at difficult times.
And I want a little bit talk about Twitter, because everyone is so quick to judge. Someone who's an educator, what are your thoughts on that? How do you sort of help teenagers nowadays not to be so quick to do name calling, judging? What are the ways that we can educate our youth to do better?
One thing that I encourage in my class is to say, you know, make a mistake. It's good. There's nothing wrong with making a mistake. And I think that, you know, when someone tweets something out that we don't agree with, we're sometimes like, how can you say that? It's, if you were in the room with that person, you'd be like, oh, you must have made a mistake. That's fine. I think once things are written, once we see it's there in writing, we give it sort of the importance of something that's written into law, which it isn't. It's something someone said, and people say silly things, you know. So I think we just got to realize that as permanent as the internet is, humans are not as permanent, and there's no need to give it that grandiose importance.
But what I'm also hearing is we have to be more tolerant.
Yeah, absolutely. People make mistakes, and it's okay. And you do get that flexibility more when it's eye to eye. I mean, there's that section, I think it's on Jimmy Kimmel, where people read mean tweets that were written about them. And those are things that no one would say to their friend's face. No one ever. And so to focus on the human nature, to focus on the ability to make mistakes, and people say things, and that's fine. I think that is something we definitely need to see more of.
Another side of the human nature is being optimistic and having Thanksgiving for everything that's happening to you. And I know that you have recorded a talk on that. So I was wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about it.
Absolutely. Gratitude is something that is shown to repeatedly be of physical health, mental health, have huge benefits to who we are. And especially in an environment of negative headlines and the world moving so fast, I think just recognizing what it is that we're thankful for is so important. And that connects as well to the idea of people just recognizing what they have on the day-to-day basis and sort of savoring not only the things that we have, but also the relationships that we have, the social norms that we have. In such a polarized political environment, we sometimes don't recognize that the incredible things that we've achieved as a democracy are not things we should take for granted, and that we should be grateful for. It sort of a part and parcel of gratitude is recognizing that we don't take something for granted. When your friend does something for you and you say, oh, I so appreciate that, it's a way of saying, I don't take you for granted. I don't assume that you had to do that. And so that connection between gratitude and recognizing that something didn't have to be there applies both in our personal life, just being thankful for water, food, shelter, but also in terms of like broader connections, whether it's family, recognizing that family is something important, recognizing society society, our city, our state, our country, the world as we know it is unbelievable. I mean, if you look at, we sometimes feel like we're living at the worst time in history. There's never been such a stretch in history with so little wars. We've never lived such a long stretch without wars. And so just knowing that all this is something that we're incredibly lucky to have, that we live in a really unbelievably auspicious time. When you sit to eat dinner, you can sit and listen to any symphony you want. The King of England didn't have that 100 years ago. So I think we need to recognize that.
And for the folks that are constantly into achievement, reaching for the bigger goal, what suggestions do you have for them? Because for them, they would say too, food and shelter is just a basic thing. I should have that.
You know, I had a really sad story. In my role as a rabbi, I sometimes visit people when they're sick. And so I was called to visit someone on their deathbed. And so the person is literally one step away from death. And I prayed with them, I stood with them, and they died shortly thereafter. And a few days later, I spoke to someone and they said, "Oh, did you know this person? He was just such an incredibly successful businessman worth hundreds of millions of dollars and with such enthusiasm." And I couldn't help feeling bad and disconnect because all those millions and everything, it wasn't worth much for them at their last moments. You know, when you don't have all your family with you, or when you're not in a state of peace with yourself and with others, it loses its value. So big goals are important. And I very much encourage young people to set huge goals, and we should all definitely set goals. But sometimes, even if we achieve those goals, when we forget about the basics, those goals are really not worth anything to us, because there's a folk tale about this very wealthy guy who got stuck in the safe in his house and died from hunger. At some point, you ask yourself, is the big goal above everything else, or is it instead of? And if it's instead of the basics, you definitely are not achieving a lot. And if it's in addition, then that's beautiful. That's terrific. I'm all for big goals.
So it seems to me you have to choose wisely or think wisely.
Absolutely. And never forget the basics, you know, family, friends, relationships. We just marked 9/11 a few days ago, and there are so many stories of people who called their loved ones, you know, when they recognize it's their last minutes and they say, you know, "I wish I would have told you I love you more often," or "I wish I would have spent more time with you." And that's really something that should be core to who we are, not to forget what the basics are, not to forget what the most important things are. And then if we achieve beyond that, that's even better.
So how do we bring more of that human connection to your life?
That's a very good question. I was so sad to see that England opened, like we have a Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Education. They opened a Ministry of Loneliness to deal with the epidemic of loneliness. It's a real problem in Western civilization where people feel disconnected. I think that going out there is something that's key. So, for example, here in New York City, there's always an event, there's always something. And just doing that, you know, I think everyone would agree that it's never easy to go out to an event, right? You got to get dressed. It's awkward to introduce yourself to new people, whether it's at a new yoga class, walk in Central Park, a paint class, a music class. However, doing that and going out there and meeting people, becoming part of a community, joining a community are all key elements of building those human relationships. There's definitely many opportunities out there. It's just never easy to jump into the cold water. And that's very true for business as well. If you look at a networking event, introducing your pitch, coming up with your idea, there's always the original unpleasant side of things, but you got to overcome that. So that's true also socially. It's never going to come your way. No one's going to come knocking on your door saying, "Let's hang out." However, going out there, going to events, getting yourself out there, meeting people, creating friendships is definitely something that's in our own best interest.
And it seems to me the more you do it, the better you get at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a caveat, though, and I think that's a caveat you see a lot in New York. My wife and I call it the options crisis, where people, they become so good at it that they just keep on hopping from, you know, they're like, "Oh, maybe I'll find a good friend in the next event," failing to really give the first event or social engagement its maximum potential. So once you've gone to an event, once you picked up a relationship, I think that sustaining a relationship and keeping up a social circle are definitely things that also needs to be attended to. And sometimes when you buy a new tree or a new plant, you're better off watering what you got than running to buy the next one. So that's true also in social relationships. Making sure that we keep up the relationships that we built is definitely something that can go a very long way.
So spend time with folks.
Sure, yeah. So if you went to a violin class, if you went to a yoga class and someone there is interested in jogging together, or stay in touch, don't be shy, stay in touch and keep up that relationship if it's a relationship you want to keep up. If there's a business networking meeting there and someone gives you their card, there's nothing more insulting than someone who gives you their card and then you don't follow up on it. So keep up the relationships.
Any advice for folks that might be a little bit too scared to do that, to put themselves out there?
So I would say find something that's a little bit out of your comfort zone. And so if you feel most comfortable with the setting of 2 people, 3 people, 10 people, whatever it is that you feel most comfortable with, go for that setting. It's just incredible today with the internet how much you can connect really with the exact thing that you're looking for. And so if you feel intimidated by groups of 30 people, see if there's something that's more of a 15 people type of event and go for that. And I think this definitely goes back to youth, because so often it's frowned upon to introduce yourself and to go places and to say, oh, can I come to your house over the weekend? Can we do homework together? So I think taking that one step out of our comfort zones and meeting those people is definitely something that I would urge everyone to do. And something that I found transformative is I wanted to give a TED Talk, and I literally just Googled who's arranging TED Talks around me, and I submitted randomly applications to some places, and someone picked it up and said, sure, I'd love to have you come and pitch. And eventually they heard my pitch and I came and spoke. It wasn't an easy thing, but it was something that ended up creating some of the more meaningful relationships that I have. I'm still friends with some of my co-speakers, with the producer. And so going out of your comfort zone is most definitely something that you may look back and say, wow, I am so happy I did that.
And what I like, you touched on something that I think it's very important, is that following through.
Yeah, because, it's so easy to just go back home and snuggle under our covers. But keeping up the relationship, saying, oh, I really enjoyed meeting you. Can we sit down for coffee in a few days? Or I enjoyed jogging with you. You want to go jogging again, or whatever it may be. I think that's key. We have often young people over for Friday night dinners, and people really crave that human connection. And there are some people who will send an email a day later and say, wow, thanks so much for having me. I'd love to stay in touch afterwards. And we stay in touch with them. And from what I see, it's a meaningful relationship to them. But they had to step out of their comfort zone and say, I appreciate it. I'd love to keep in touch. And those are really relationships you end up cherishing.
So from a teacher perspective, I'd like to hear your thoughts on curiosity. And why do you think it's so important to bring into any aspect of your life?
Yeah, so that's such a good question. And it's so difficult because as a teacher, you're sort of balancing. On the one hand, you don't want to go too far off topic. On the other hand, really curiosity is what drives all learning. If you had someone that was sort of curious and didn't want to know much, then that person wouldn't be able to learn anything. And so making sure that we cultivate a culture of curiosity, of exploration, is at the heart of what learning is all about. A friend of mine works at NASA, and he mentioned to me that the United States puts incredible amounts of money into space exploration. And people ask, like, what's the point? You just spent a few billions of dollars on sending up a space shuttle. So what was the point of that? And one of the studies that they did found that the kids who live in that time where the space shuttle goes up, when they grow up, a much higher number of doctors, engineers, mathematicians. And that's because their curiosity was sparked. And so it's our responsibility to do things that spark children's curiosity, and they want to know more, and they see that there is more to find out. And I think that's why countries invest so much in things like space exploration, because once you teach kids that there's so many things out there to be learned and there's so many things out there to be achieved, and you show them that it's up to exploration, that benefits society, the economy, and education tremendously.
And it's interesting because by you doing something, you actually create meaningful impact in other people's lives.
Absolutely.
In your opinion, what inspires youth to be better leaders?
Letting people know that they are the ones who can effectuate change, knowing that change won't just happen and they are the ones who should be doing it, is most definitely something that inspires leadership. Letting people know that they can do it, that no one should be telling them what they can't do. People should be telling them what they could do, is also an important key of leadership. And finally, making sure that people have passions, things that they are passionate about, things they can think differently about, I think is a key element. And we live in a world that needs leaders for good, people who will envision a better future. And that starts really with the day-to-day tasks of letting young people know, you can do this, why don't you take charge? It can sometimes start with really small things, write in a school newspaper, volunteer here, do something there. That cultivates a culture of leadership.
Any final thoughts?
First of all, thank you so much for having me on. That has been It's been really terrific. I think a final important thought is that it's much easier to think and reflect than to imagine, and something that we tend to do less today because of all the wealth of information that comes to us is to imagine things and to say, okay, what if we did this differently? What if we did that differently? And so to sort of imagine and inspire young people to imagine a better world, a better outcome, better products, a better workplace, I think that's something that we need for ourselves, and also to imagine our own lives. Like, what if my life can be different? What can I be doing differently in my life? I think the power of imagination and of sort of hoping for a better future has always been at the key of societal improvement, and I think can definitely transform who we are as individuals, families, and communities.
Wonderful. And how can people contact you, invite you to speak?
Oh, thank you. So I'm very findable online, whether it's Facebook, email, my website, rabbipoupko.com, rabbipoupko.com, and always happy to hear from people.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Poupko, for being a guest.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on, and very much look forward to speaking again.
Our very special guest was Rabbi Elchanan Poupko, writer, teacher, and a speaker. Thank you for tuning in and listening to the Leadership with Biana Kovic Show. Remember that you're all leaders in your own rights, and the impact that you're meant to achieve starts with small acts of kindness, curiosity, and generosity. Please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you again, and until next time.